My fiancée ended our engagement saying she never really loved me and disappeared from my life. A year later, her sister handed me the son she secretly carried and never told me about. I proposed to a woman named Iris on her 27th birthday. We had been together for 5 years, and I knew from our first date that I wanted to spend my life with her. She said yes before I even finished asking the question. We started planning our wedding immediately. We picked a date 6 months away. We found a venue. We sent save the dates to everyone we knew. I had never been happier in my entire life. Then 3 months before the wedding, everything changed. Iris came home one evening and sat me down in our living room. She said she couldn't marry me. She said she didn't love me anymore, and she wasn't sure she ever really did. She said she had been lying to herself for years and she couldn't keep pretending. She said she was sorry, but she needed to leave. I asked what I did wrong. She said I didn't do anything wrong. She said it just wasn't there anymore, and she couldn't explain it better than that. She said she needed space and she was moving in with her sister until she figured out her next steps. She packed a bag that night and left. I called her every day for 2 weeks. She answered twice. Both times she said the same thing. She said her feelings changed and there was nothing either of us could do about it. She said I deserved someone who actually loved me, and that person wasn't her. She said I should move on and find happiness without her. The 3rd week she changed her number. Her sister told me to stop calling and give Iris the space she asked for. Her friends told me the same thing. Everyone acted like I was the problem for not accepting that the woman I loved had simply stopped loving me overnight. I didn't understand. I went over every conversation, every moment, every memory trying to find the thing I missed. We were happy. We were planning a future. She looked at me like I was everything to her, and then one day she looked at me like I was a stranger she needed to escape from. I fell apart for a while. I stopped eating properly. I couldn't sleep. I went to work and came home and sat in our empty apartment surrounded by wedding planning materials that meant nothing anymore. My friends told me I needed to move on. My family said the same thing. Everyone said Iris made her choice and I had to respect it even if I didn't understand it. So I tried. I packed up her things and put them in storage. I took down the photos. I canceled the venue and the caterer and the florist. I told everyone the wedding was off and endured the pitying looks and the whispered conversations. A year passed. I wasn't over her, but I was functioning. I went on a few dates that led nowhere. I focused on work. I tried to build a life that didn't have her at the center of it. Then one afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Iris's sister asking if we could meet. She said it was important and she had something to give me. I almost said no. I almost told her I had moved on and didn't want to reopen old wounds. But something in her voice made me say yes. We met at a coffee shop near my office. She was already there when I arrived. She looked like she had been crying. She had an envelope in her hands and she slid it across the table before I even sat down. She said Iris passed away 2 weeks ago. I didn't understand what she meant at first. I asked passed away from what? She said cancer. She said Iris was diagnosed a week before she ended our engagement. Stage 3. The doctors gave her a year, maybe 2 if the treatments worked. She said Iris made everyone promise not to tell me. She said Iris didn't want me to watch her die. She didn't want me to spend the last year of her life taking care of her and then grieving her forever. She thought if she made me hate her, I would move on and find someone healthy who could give me the life she couldn't. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing. The woman I loved didn't stop loving me. She loved me so much she lied to my face to set me free. She spent the last year of her life alone because she thought that was better for me. She died thinking she did the right thing. Iris's sister pushed the envelope closer to me. She said there was more. She said Iris found out she was pregnant a month after the diagnosis. I opened the envelope and my hands shook so hard the papers nearly fell out. Medical records spilled across the table first, then ultrasound photos showing a tiny form in grainy black and white. The letter came last, written in Iris's handwriting that I still recognized after a year. She wrote that she was 8 weeks pregnant when they found the cancer. She wrote that the doctors told her to end the pregnancy so she could do stronger treatments. She wrote that she refused because this baby was ours, and she wanted me to have part of her even after she was gone. She spent months making sure our son would be healthy while the cancer spread through her body. The sister told me his name was Christian. She said he was in her car right now. She said Iris's final wish was for me to raise him. I stood up without meaning to and walked toward the parking lot. Everything felt distant and strange, like I was moving through water. The sister followed me and pointed to a small blue sedan parked near the entrance. I saw a car seat in the back with a dark-haired toddler strapped inside. He was playing with a gray stuffed elephant and making it dance in the air. I got closer and looked through the window. He had Iris's brown eyes and my nose and my mouth. He looked up at me through the glass and stopped playing. The sister opened the door and he reached both arms toward me. He said hi in this tiny voice that made my chest hurt. I realized my entire life had just changed again in 20 minutes. A year ago, Iris left me. 20 minutes ago, I found out she died. Now I was looking at my son, who I never knew existed. We went back inside the coffee shop because I couldn't process any of this standing in a parking lot. The sister lifted Christian out of his car seat and brought him inside. She set him on my lap, and he settled there like he'd known me his whole life. His small hands grabbed my shirt, and he looked up at my face with those eyes that were so much like Iris's. The sister explained she'd been taking care of him since Iris died 2 weeks ago. She said Iris left very clear instructions that I was his father and should raise him. She handed me a diaper bag covered in cartoon animals. Then she gave me a thick folder of legal documents. Last, she pulled out a leather journal and said it was Iris's from the past year. Christian wiggled on my lap and pointed at my coffee cup. The sister said he was almost 15 months old. She said he was healthy and happy and had been asking for Mama since Iris passed. She said Iris talked about me every single day and showed him my photo constantly. She started crying while she told me all this, and I just sat there holding this child who was mine, but felt like a stranger. I took Christian home to my apartment and had no idea what I was doing. The sister helped me carry his things up the stairs. She showed me how to mix his bottle and what foods he could eat. She left after an hour, and suddenly I was alone with a toddler in an apartment that had no baby furniture or supplies. Christian walked around exploring everything while I watched him. He touched the couch and the coffee table and my shoes by the door. When it got late, I didn't have a crib, so I made a nest of blankets on my bed. I laid him down and he fell asleep almost immediately, like this was completely normal for him. I sat on the floor next to the bed and just watched him sleep. Every time I looked at his face, I saw Iris and felt this crushing mix of love and rage. She kept him from me. She carried our baby and gave birth and spent a year raising him, and I missed all of it. She made a choice this enormous without giving me any say. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there trying to understand how the woman I loved could do something like this. Christian woke up crying around 6 in the morning, and I had no idea what to do. He stood up in the blankets and reached for me, crying Mama over and over. I picked him up and he kept crying. I tried giving him the bottle the sister showed me how to make, but he pushed it away. I tried putting him down, but he screamed louder. I walked around the apartment with him and he just kept crying in my arms. After 30 minutes of this, I called my brother Hadrian in complete panic. He answered sounding half asleep, and I told him I needed help right now. He asked what was wrong, and I said I had a son and didn't know what to do. There was silence on the other end. Then he said he was coming over and hung up. Hadrian arrived 40 minutes later with his wife and their 2 kids. He brought bags of supplies and boxes of diapers and containers of food. Christian had finally stopped crying, but was clinging to me and wouldn't let go. Hadrian stared at us for a long moment. He asked where this child came from. I told him the whole story while his wife started organizing supplies in my kitchen. Iris had cancer. Iris got pregnant. Iris died. Her sister brought me my son yesterday. Hadrian looked shocked, but he didn't ask a million questions. He just started showing me basic things I needed to know. His wife demonstrated how to change a diaper on my bed while Christian watched. She explained what toddlers eat and how much and how often. She showed me how to check if his diaper needed changing and how to tell if he was hungry or tired or sick. Hadrian's kids played with Christian on the floor, and he seemed happy for the first time since waking up. They stayed for 3 hours, teaching me everything they could think of. When they left, Hadrian hugged me and said he'd come back tomorrow. He said I wasn't alone in this. I read Iris's journal that night after Christian finally fell asleep again. It destroyed me all over again. She wrote about feeling him kick during chemo sessions. She wrote about choosing treatments that wouldn't harm the baby, even though stronger options might have given her more time. She described being so sick from the chemo she could barely stand, but still getting up to take care of him. She wrote about the first time he smiled at her, and the first time he said Mama. She wrote about loving me so much she couldn't bear to trap me in a life of watching her die and then raising our son alone while grieving her. She truly believed pushing me away was the kindest thing she could do. She thought if she made me hate her, I would move on and find someone healthy. She thought I would build a happy life without her. Reading her words felt like being stabbed over and over. She loved me through everything. She suffered alone because she thought it would hurt me less. My mother Margot showed up the next morning without calling first. Hadrian must have told her. She walked in and saw Christian playing with plastic cups on my kitchen floor. She stopped in the doorway and stared at him. Then she walked over and knelt down next to him. She said hello to him in this soft voice. Christian looked up at her and smiled. She started crying immediately. She picked him up and held him and cried into his hair. She said, "This is my grandson, and I never got to meet him." She was angry at Iris for the same reasons I was, but I could see her trying to understand it too. She stayed all day. She made a list of everything I needed to buy for a toddler. She took me to the store and we filled 2 carts with supplies. Crib and changing table and car seat and clothes and toys and bottles and sippy cups and more food than I thought one small person could eat. She helped me set everything up in my apartment. She showed me her tricks for getting toddlers to eat vegetables and go to sleep and stay entertained. By the time she left that evening, my apartment looked completely different. I missed 3 days of work because I couldn't figure out childcare, and I was barely holding myself together. Christian needed constant attention, and I was running on no sleep and trying to process everything that happened. Finally, I called my boss and explained the situation. I told her my ex-fiancé died and her sister just gave me the son I never knew I had. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Take 2 weeks of emergency leave and sort out my new reality." She said my job would be here when I got back. I spent those first days in pure survival mode. I kept Christian fed and safe and clean. I learned his schedule and his favorite foods and the way he liked to be held when he was tired. My brain was still trying to catch up to the fact that I was a father now. Sterling came over on day 4 with Chinese food and beer. He found me sitting on my living room floor surrounded by unassembled furniture. Christian was asleep in his new crib in my bedroom. Sterling looked at the boxes and looked at me and asked if I was okay. I said no. He sat down on the floor next to me and opened the beer. I told him everything while we ate. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said he was sorry about Iris, but he was also angry at her on my behalf. He said she made a huge choice that affected my entire life and didn't give me any say in it. He said I had a right to be furious even though she was dead, and even though she did it from love. He was the first person who validated my anger without making excuses for her. We spent the next 3 hours putting together a crib and a changing table and a small bookshelf. Sterling told me stories about his own kids to distract me. By the time he left, I had furniture and felt slightly less alone. Christian got sick on day 5 with a fever that scared me. He felt hot to the touch and was crying in a way that sounded different from his normal crying. I didn't know what was normal for a sick toddler. I didn't know if this was serious or just a cold. By midnight, I was panicking. I packed him in the car and drove to the emergency room. The doctor was a middle-aged woman who examined Christian while I stood there terrified. She checked his temperature and his throat and his ears. She said it was just a common cold and his fever should break in a day or 2. She noticed how scared I was and asked if I was a new parent. I said I just found out he existed 5 days ago. She looked surprised but didn't ask questions. She gave me a referral card for a pediatrician named Celine, who specialized in helping new parents. She said Celine was good with situations like mine. I took Christian home feeling completely incompetent and terrified I was going to mess this up somehow. I called my mother that evening and asked if she knew any family lawyers. She gave me a name without asking too many questions. Gracelyn Peterson had an office downtown in one of those old buildings with high ceilings and wood paneling that made everything feel serious. I brought all the documents Iris's sister gave me in a folder that felt too thin for how much my life had changed. Gracelyn was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s. With reading glasses, she kept pushing up her nose while she reviewed the paperwork. She spread everything across her desk and went through each page carefully. The birth certificate listed me as father. Iris's will designated me as sole guardian. There were medical records showing Iris had been lucid and competent when she made these decisions. Gracelyn looked up at me after reading through everything twice. She said the good news was there wouldn't be a custody battle. Iris's wishes were documented clearly and legally binding. She asked if any family members were contesting the arrangement. I told her about the sister who brought Christian to me and said Iris's parents might have opinions, but I didn't know their position yet. Gracelyn made notes on a yellow legal pad. She explained we needed to file paperwork with the court to formalize my guardianship, even though I was listed as father. She said it was mostly procedural but important for things like medical decisions and school enrollment down the line. She asked about life insurance. I pulled out the policy Iris had left. It was small, only $50,000, designated for Christian's care. Gracelyn said she could help me set up a trust account, so the money would be protected for his needs. We spent 2 hours going over details I barely understood. She wrote down deadlines and filing requirements and court dates. By the time I left her office, I had a folder twice as thick and a bill for her retainer that made my stomach hurt. But at least I knew Christian was legally mine, and nobody could take him away. 3 days later, someone knocked on my apartment door at 7 in the morning. Christian was eating cereal in his high chair, and I was still in yesterday's clothes because he'd been up half the night. I opened the door and found a man in his 60s with Iris's exact eyes staring at me. He didn't introduce himself. He pushed past me into the apartment and looked around like he was inspecting the place. Christian looked up from his cereal and said hi. The man walked straight to him and picked him up out of the high chair without asking. I felt my whole body go tense. I asked who he was even though I already knew. He said his name was Maximus and he was Christian's grandfather. He said his daughter died and nobody told him about his grandson until 2 weeks ago. He said Iris's sister finally admitted the truth, and now here he was looking at a baby he should have known from birth. I told him to put Christian down. He ignored me and kept holding him, studying his face like he was looking for pieces of Iris. Christian started fussing because a stranger was holding him and he wanted down. Maximus finally set him back in the high chair, but he didn't step away. He turned to me and his face was hard. He said I had no right to keep Christian from his family. He said Iris was sick and made bad decisions and her family should be raising this boy. I grabbed the folder from Graceland's office and showed him the will. I showed him the guardianship documents. I told him Iris chose this and put it in writing when she was completely clear-headed. He read the pages and his hands shook. He said Iris was his daughter and she was dying and she wasn't thinking straight. He said I was some guy she dated for a few years and his family had known her whole life. I asked him where he was when she was pregnant and sick. I asked why she didn't go to her family if they were so close. He didn't have an answer for that. We stood there in my kitchen arguing while Christian ate cereal and watched us like he knew something bad was happening. Maximus said things about me not being ready to be a father and not having family support and living in a one-bedroom apartment. I said things about Iris choosing me over her family for a reason and him not respecting her wishes even in death. We were both yelling by the end. Christian started crying. I picked him up and held him and told Maximus he needed to leave. He looked at me holding his grandson, and I saw my own pain reflected back. We were both men who loved Iris and got abandoned by her choices. He lost his daughter. I lost the woman I was going to marry. Neither of us got a say in how this played out. He left without saying goodbye to Christian. I sat on the floor with my son in my lap and shook from adrenaline. I didn't know if Maximus would try to fight me legally or just show up again. I called Graceland and told her what happened. She said to document everything and not let him take Christian anywhere without supervision. She said Iris's will was clear, but grandparents sometimes had rights depending on the state. She'd look into it and call me back. I spent the rest of the day jumping every time I heard footsteps in the hallway. That night I woke up at 2 a.m. with my heart racing and my chest tight. I couldn't breathe right. I sat up in bed and tried to calm down, but the panic just got worse. Christian was asleep in his crib next to my bed, and I was terrified I was having a heart attack and he'd wake up alone with my body. I called my doctor's emergency line and described what was happening. The nurse asked if I was under unusual stress. I almost laughed. She said it sounded like a panic attack and I should try breathing exercises. She also said I should talk to someone about what I was dealing with. She gave me a number for a grief counselor who worked with the practice. I called the counselor the next day and got an appointment for that week. Her office was in a medical building near the hospital where I'd taken Christian that first night. She was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and a calm way of talking that made me feel less crazy. I sat in her office and told her everything. Iris ending our engagement, finding out about the cancer, meeting Christian, Maximus showing up, the panic attack. She listened without interrupting and took notes on a tablet. She asked how I was sleeping. I said barely. She asked if I was eating. I said when I remembered. She asked if I had support. I listed my family in Sterling and she nodded like that was good. Then she asked how I felt about Iris. I didn't know how to answer that. I said I loved her. I said I hated her. I said I understood why she lied. I said I'd never forgive her for it. She wrote something down and looked at me. She said it was possible to be angry at someone's choice while respecting that they made it from love. She said Iris believed she was protecting me even though I didn't get to decide if I wanted that protection. She said grief was complicated and I didn't have to resolve my feelings quickly or neatly. She said becoming a father overnight to a child I didn't know existed while processing the death of someone I loved was trauma on top of trauma. She scheduled me for weekly appointments and gave me some techniques for managing the panic attacks. By the time I left, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely losing my mind. Christian started calling me Dada in his second week with me. I was changing his diaper and he looked right at me and said it clear as anything. Dada. I froze with the clean diaper in my hand. He said it again and reached for my face with his small, sticky fingers. Something cracked open in my chest. This tiny person who lost his mother and got handed to a stranger was trying to attach to me anyway. He was trusting me to take care of him, even though he had no reason to believe I wouldn't disappear too. I picked him up and held him and cried into his hair. He patted my shoulder like he was comforting me. My anger at Iris was still there, but now it was competing with this huge, protective love for our son that I didn't expect to feel so fast. My emergency leave ended and I had to go back to work. I called the daycare near my office and they said their waiting list was 6 months long. I sat at my kitchen table trying to figure out childcare and coming up empty. My mother called to check on us and I told her my problem. She said she could watch Christian 3 days a week. Hadrian's wife offered to take the other 2 days. I felt guilty accepting their help, but I didn't have other options. My first day back at work, I dropped Christian off at my mother's house at 7 a.m. He cried when I left and I almost turned around and took him home. My mother texted me a photo an hour later of him playing with blocks and smiling. I tried to focus on work but kept checking my phone. I left a meeting early to pick him up on time. I worked from home the next day because he was fussy, and I couldn't concentrate knowing he was upset somewhere else. My boss called me into her office at the end of the week. I thought I was getting fired. Instead, she asked how I was managing. I told her honestly that I was barely holding it together. She said she had kids and understood the adjustment. She said to do my best and let her know if I needed accommodations. I realized my entire life structure needed to change. I couldn't work the same hours or take the same projects or advance my career the same way. Christian had to come first now, whether I was ready for that or not. Iris's sister showed up on Saturday with boxes stacked in her car. She said she'd been keeping Christian's things at her house and thought I should have them now. We carried everything up to my apartment. Clothes in different sizes, toys he'd played with, books Iris read to him, a baby blanket with his name embroidered on it, photos. So many photos of Iris holding him during her final months. I looked at one picture of her sitting in a hospital chair with Christian asleep on her chest. She was bald from chemo, and so thin her bones showed through her skin. But she was smiling at him like he was everything. I had to leave the room. I went into my bedroom and closed the door and pressed my hands against my eyes. The sister knocked softly and asked if I was okay. I said I needed a minute. She organized everything while I pulled myself together. When I came back out, she was folding tiny clothes into drawers. She said Iris talked to Christian about me every day. She showed him my photo and told him that's your daddy. She said Iris wanted him to know my face, so when he met me, it wouldn't be completely strange. I asked why Iris didn't just tell me. The sister stopped folding and looked at me. She said Iris was trying to give me a life without grief. She thought watching her die would destroy me. She thought raising Christian alone would be easier than raising him while watching her suffer. I said that wasn't her choice to make. The sister agreed. She said she told Iris that 100 times, but Iris wouldn't listen. She said Iris could be stubborn when she thought she was right. I remembered that about her. It was one of the things I loved, and now it was one of the things I resented most. I remembered that about her too. The sister finished putting away Christian's clothes and said she needed to get going. She hugged me at the door and told me to call if I needed anything. I watched her drive away and then looked at Christian playing with blocks on my living room floor. He stacked 3 blocks and knocked them down and laughed like it was the best thing that had ever happened. I sat down next to him and he climbed into my lap without hesitation. I held him and thought about how Iris carried him while dying and never told me, how she made everyone lie to me for an entire year, how she thought she was protecting me, but really she just took away my choices. My phone rang a few days later while I was at work. It was a number I didn't know, but I answered anyway. A man's voice said my name and asked if I had a minute to talk. I recognized the voice after a second. It was Maximus, Iris's father. I hadn't heard from him since before the funeral. He said he wanted to apologize for how he acted when he showed up at my apartment. He said he was grieving and angry and took it out on me when I didn't deserve it. He said he'd been thinking a lot about what Iris wanted and what was best for Christian. He said fighting me wouldn't bring his daughter back, and Christian needed stability more than he needed another custody battle. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. He asked if he could have a relationship with Christian. He said he understood if I said no, but he was hoping we could work something out. He said Christian was all he had left of Iris and he wanted to know his grandson. I told him I'd been thinking about the same thing. I said Christian deserved to know his grandfather, and I didn't want to keep them apart. We talked for almost an hour about how to make it work. We agreed on supervised visits at my parents' house, where Christian could spend time with Maximus without any custody concerns. We set up the first visit for the following Saturday. When the day came, I drove Christian to my parents' house, and Maximus was already there waiting on the porch. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. He smiled when he saw Christian, and his whole face changed. My mother led us into the house and made coffee nobody drank. Maximus sat on the floor with Christian and showed him a photo album he'd brought. Pictures of Iris as a baby, as a little girl, as a teenager. Christian didn't understand what he was looking at, but he liked turning the pages. Maximus told stories about each photo and his voice kept breaking. I sat on the couch watching 2 people grieve the same woman in completely different ways. Christian got bored with the album and went to play with the toy box my mother kept for when Hadrian's kids visited. Maximus and I sat there in awkward silence. He finally said he was sorry for everything. He said Iris made him promise not to tell me about the cancer or the baby, and he kept that promise even though he thought it was wrong. He said he argued with her about it constantly, but she wouldn't budge. He said watching her die while keeping her secrets was the hardest thing he'd ever done. I told him I understood impossible promises. We watched Christian play with trucks, and both of us were thinking about Iris. The visit lasted 2 hours and ended with Maximus asking if he could come back next week. I said yes. He hugged Christian goodbye, and Christian waved at him. On the drive home, Christian fell asleep in his car seat, and I thought about how sad it was that grief was the only thing connecting me to Maximus now. That night, after I put Christian to bed, I was organizing more of the boxes his aunt had brought over. I found a baby book at the bottom of one box. It had Christian's name written on the front in Iris's handwriting. I opened it and saw she'd filled in every page: his birth weight and length, the hospital where he was born, his first bath, his first smile at 6 weeks, his first tooth at 5 months, his first word at 9 months. Every milestone documented with photos and dates and little notes in the margins. She wrote about how he laughed when she made funny faces, how he loved bath time, how he cried when she left the room. She wrote letters to me throughout the book, letters she never sent. She wrote about how much it hurt to document these moments knowing I was missing them, how she wanted to call me every single day, how she almost told me 100 times but stopped herself. She wrote that she hoped someday I'd understand why she made this choice, that she hoped I'd forgive her, that she hoped Christian would have the life she couldn't give him. I read every page twice and felt like someone was stabbing me over and over. She documented everything I should have experienced, every smile I should have seen, every milestone I should have celebrated. She kept it all from me and wrote it down like that would somehow make it better. I closed the book and put it on the shelf in Christian's room. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to look at it again without wanting to scream. The next Monday, I had to go back to work after taking another day off. Christian cried when I tried to leave him at my mother's house. He wrapped his arms around my neck and screamed and wouldn't let go. My mother had to pry him off me while he sobbed. I drove to work feeling like the worst father in the world. I couldn't focus on anything. I kept checking my phone to see if my mother had texted. She finally sent me a photo an hour later of Christian playing with blocks and smiling, but I still felt sick. I left work early and picked him up, and he clung to me the whole drive home. The same thing happened the next day. And the day after that, Christian started screaming the moment we pulled up to my mother's house. He knew what was coming and he was terrified. I called Celine and asked if this was normal. She said separation anxiety was completely normal for his age and situation. She said he'd lost his primary caregiver and now he was scared of losing me too. She said the best thing I could do was stick to predictable routines and show him through consistency that I wasn't going anywhere. I started doing shorter work days. I came home for lunch. I worked from home when I could. I made sure I was always the one who picked him up. Slowly, Christian started to trust that I would come back. The screaming got shorter. Then it stopped completely. But I could still see the fear in his eyes every morning when I left. Sterling called me on a Wednesday night and said he had someone he wanted me to meet. A woman from his office who was smart and funny and recently single. He said I needed adult connection and he thought we'd get along. I told him I wasn't ready to date. He said I didn't have to be ready, I just had to show up for coffee. I agreed because Sterling wouldn't stop asking. The date was supposed to be Saturday afternoon. I spent the whole week dreading it. Saturday morning, I woke up and looked at Christian eating breakfast in his high chair, and I couldn't do it. I texted Sterling and said I had to cancel. He called me immediately and asked what was wrong. I told him the truth. I was barely keeping my head above water with work and parenting. I was still processing Iris dying and lying to me for a year. I couldn't imagine sitting across from a stranger and explaining that I had a son I didn't know existed until 2 months ago. I couldn't imagine trying to connect with someone new when my entire emotional capacity was consumed by grief and learning how to be a father. Sterling was quiet for a minute, and then he said he understood. He said he'd tell his coworker something came up. He said he was sorry for pushing and he wouldn't do it again. I thanked him and hung up and felt relieved and lonely at the same time. My mother suggested I needed to get Christian around other kids his age. She found a toddler playgroup that met at the community center on Thursday mornings. I took a late start at work and brought Christian to the first session. The room was full of mothers and toddlers. I was the only father there. Everyone was friendly, but I could see them looking at me and Christian and wondering about us. A woman asked how old Christian was and where his mother was. I said he was 14 months and his mother passed away. She looked horrified and said she was so sorry. Other mothers overheard and came over to offer condolences. I stood there holding Christian and trying not to run out of the room. I wasn't ready to tell Iris's story to strangers. I wasn't ready to see their pity and curiosity. Christian didn't care about any of that. He saw other kids playing with toys and wiggled out of my arms to join them. I watched him play with a little girl who was building a tower. He knocked it down and she laughed and rebuilt it. He was happy. He needed this. I sat on a chair against the wall and tried to look like I belonged there. A mother sat down next to me and started talking about her daughter's sleep schedule. I nodded and pretended to follow along. The whole time I was thinking about how Christian needed social interaction I wasn't providing, how I needed to get over my discomfort and bring him here every week. How being a good father meant doing things that made me uncomfortable. I kept reading Iris's journal in small pieces because reading too much at once made me too angry to function. One night I found an entry from her 7th month of pregnancy. She wrote about almost calling me that day. She wrote about seeing me at a coffee shop near my office with a woman I'd gone on 2 dates with. She wrote about watching us talk and laugh and how much it hurt to see me trying to move on. She wrote that she wanted to run over and tell me everything. Tell me about the baby. Tell me about the cancer. Tell me she still loved me and never stopped, but she didn't. She wrote that she sat in her car and cried and then drove home and convinced herself she was doing the right thing. She wrote that sparing me from impossible pain was an act of love, even though it was killing her. She wrote about watching me from a distance during her entire pregnancy, seeing me go to work, seeing me try to date, seeing me slowly start to look less broken. She thought she was setting me free. Every page of her journal showed how much she loved me, which somehow made her choice even harder to accept. She loved me enough to lie to my face. She loved me enough to die alone. She loved me enough to keep our son from me. I closed the journal and put it away, and didn't open it again for a week. I had my regular appointment with the grief counselor on Tuesday afternoon. My mother watched Christian and I drove to the office and sat in the waiting room, trying to figure out what I wanted to talk about. When the counselor called me in, I sat down and said I needed to admit something. I said I was furious at Iris, not just sad or confused, but actually angry. I was angry that she died. I was angry that she lied. I was angry that she made choices about my entire life without asking me. I was angry that she left me alone with a child I was terrified of failing. I said I felt guilty for being mad at someone who was dead and who made her choices out of love. But I was still angry, and I didn't know what to do with that feeling. The counselor listened and then said anger was a normal part of grief. She said I didn't have to resolve it quickly or feel guilty for feeling it. She said being angry at Iris didn't mean I didn't love her or understand her choices. She said I could be angry and sad and grateful all at the same time. She said I didn't have to forgive Iris right now or maybe ever. I just had to keep moving forward and taking care of Christian and processing my feelings as they came. She said permission to be angry without shame was important. I left that session feeling like I could breathe a little easier. Christian got sick again on Friday night. He threw up all over his crib and himself and me. I cleaned him up and changed his sheets and he threw up again an hour later. This kept happening all night. By morning, he had diarrhea too, and I was completely exhausted and starting to panic. I called Celine and she said it sounded like a stomach bug. She told me to keep him hydrated and watch for signs of dehydration. I asked what those signs were and she listed them. Dry mouth, no tears when crying, no wet diapers, sunken eyes. She said to call her if I saw any of those things. I spent the entire weekend managing vomit and diarrhea and trying to get Christian to drink water. He was miserable and clingy and I felt completely helpless. Sunday afternoon, Celine called to check on us. I told her Christian still had diarrhea but seemed a little better. She said she was going to stop by and check on him. I said she didn't have to do that. She said she knew, but she wanted to. She showed up an hour later with her medical bag. She examined Christian and said he was fine. Just a normal stomach bug that would pass in another day or two. She showed me exactly what dehydration looked like and what to watch for. She was so kind and patient, and I started crying from pure overwhelm. She didn't make a big deal about it. She just handed me tissues and said being a new parent was hard, and being a suddenly single parent was even harder. She said I was doing better than I thought I was. After she left, I put Christian down for a nap and sat on the couch and stared at nothing for 20 minutes. My mother called Monday morning and suggested I join a single parent support group. She said she'd found one that met at a church near my apartment every Tuesday night. I told her I didn't have time for support groups. She said I needed to make time because I was drowning and needed help. I agreed to go to one meeting just to get her off my phone. Tuesday night, I dropped Christian at my mother's house and drove to the church. There were about 15 people sitting in a circle in a basement room. A facilitator welcomed me and asked me to introduce myself. I said my name and that I was a single father to a 14-month-old. I didn't say anything else. Other people shared their stories. A woman whose husband left her with 3 kids. A man whose wife died in a car accident. A woman whose partner walked out when their baby was 2 weeks old. Everyone had impossible situations they were navigating alone. When it was the widower's turn, he talked about his wife dying in childbirth and how he was raising their daughter while grieving someone he barely got to say goodbye to. He talked about being angry at his wife for dying, even though it wasn't her fault. He talked about loving his daughter and resenting the circumstances of her birth at the same time. I felt like he was describing my exact feelings. After the meeting, I talked to him for a few minutes. His name was Nathan, and his daughter was 6 months old. He said the anger and love existing together was the hardest part. I agreed. He gave me his number and said to call if I ever needed to talk to someone who understood. Driving home, I realized I felt less alone than I had in weeks. I made a decision Thursday night after putting Christian to bed. I called Iris's sister and asked if she still had Iris's ashes. She said yes and asked why. I said I wanted to create a small memorial space in Christian's room. Something he could see every day as he grew up. Something that would help him know his mother even though she was gone. The sister said she thought that was a beautiful idea. She brought the ashes over Saturday morning, along with some photos of Iris holding Christian as a baby. We set up a small shelf in Christian's room with the photos and the urn and a candle. The sister cried looking at it. I stood there thinking about how I wanted Christian to grow up knowing his mother loved him enough to choose his life over her own. Even if I was still working through my feelings about that choice, even if I was still angry and sad and confused, I could honor Iris for Christian while still processing my own complicated grief. The counselor had said that was possible. I was starting to believe her. Maximus showed up the following Saturday without calling first. I opened the door and found him standing there with a bag from the toy store and this look on his face like he wasn't sure I'd let him in. Christian was on the floor playing with blocks, and when he saw Maximus, he smiled and held up a red one. Maximus came inside and sat on the floor next to him. They played together for maybe 20 minutes while I made coffee in the kitchen and tried to figure out what to say to this man who lost his daughter and blamed me for choices I never got to make. Christian got tired around noon and I put him down for his nap. He fell asleep on the couch between us before I could carry him to his room. Maximus looked at him sleeping there and his whole face changed. He started talking about Iris in a way nobody had before. He told me about the last 6 months when the cancer spread to her bones and every movement hurt, but she refused the strong pain medication because the doctor said it might harm the baby. He told me she would lie in bed crying from the pain, but she wouldn't take anything stronger than what they said was safe. He told me she made him promise to find me after she was gone and make sure Christian knew his father. He said she talked about me constantly, even while she was dying. She would ask if he thought I had moved on yet, and when he said yes to make her feel better, she would cry harder. We both started crying sitting there on my couch with Christian asleep between us. Maximus said he was angry at me for months because it was easier than being angry at Iris for dying or at God for taking her. He said seeing me with Christian made him understand why she wanted this. I told him I was angry too, and I didn't know if that would ever go away completely. We sat there for a long time, not saying anything, just watching Christian sleep. When Christian woke up, Maximus helped me give him a snack and then he left. Before he walked out, he hugged me and said we were the only two people who understood this specific kind of loss. He was right. I went back to work the following Monday and asked to meet with my manager. Her name was Rachel, and she had 3 kids of her own, so when I explained my situation, she understood immediately. She said the company could offer me a flexible schedule with the option to work from home 2 days a week. I could adjust my hours to handle daycare pickup, and if Christian got sick, I could work remotely instead of taking emergency leave. The arrangement helped more than I could explain. I wasn't constantly worried about getting fired for leaving early or missing days when Christian needed me. I could actually breathe knowing I had some control over my schedule, but I also knew this changed everything for my career. I wasn't going to get promoted anytime soon. I wasn't going to take on the big projects that required travel or late nights. I was choosing to be okay with that because Christian needed stability more than I needed career advancement. Some nights I felt okay with that choice, and some nights I resented it, but I kept choosing him anyway. Finding a daycare took another week of calling around and visiting places that all had waiting lists. Then Celine mentioned a place near the hospital that had just had a family move out of state. I called them that afternoon and they had an immediate opening. I visited the next day, and it looked clean and safe and the teachers seemed kind. I signed Christian up to start the following Monday. His first day there was harder on me than it was on him. I dropped him off at 8 in the morning and he went right to the toys without looking back. I stood in the doorway watching him play, and one of the teachers had to gently suggest I should probably leave. I walked to my car and sat there crying for 10 minutes. I was scared something would happen to him when I wasn't watching. I was scared he would think I abandoned him like Iris did. I was scared of everything all the time, and it was exhausting. The daycare called me at 10 to tell me he was fine. They called again at noon to say he ate his lunch and was napping. When I picked him up at 5, he was happy and tired from playing with other kids all day. He showed me a picture he colored, and I stuck it on my refrigerator. I did better the second day. Iris's sister called me on a Wednesday night and asked if she could come by. She showed up an hour later with a cardboard box that looked heavy. She said she found it in Iris's closet when she was packing up her apartment. It was full of letters Iris had written to me over the past year but never sent. There must have been 50 of them. Some were just a few lines and some were pages long. The sister said she debated whether to give them to me, but she thought I deserved to know everything. After she left, I put Christian to bed, and then I sat on my couch and started reading. The first letter was dated 2 weeks after she left me. She wrote about her first round of chemo and how sick it made her. She wrote about missing me so much she couldn't sleep. She wrote about being pregnant and terrified and alone. I read letter after letter, and it felt like watching her die in slow motion. She wrote about her treatments and her fears and her hopes for Christian. She wrote about her love for me that never went away no matter how hard she tried to kill it. She wrote about seeing me from a distance one day when I was having coffee with a woman from work. She thought I was on a date, and it destroyed her even though she wanted me to move on. She wrote about how much it hurt to push me away and how she did it anyway because she thought it was right. I read until 3 in the morning and then I couldn't read anymore. I put the letters back in the box and shoved it in my closet because looking at it made me want to scream. Christian woke up crying around 2 in the morning a few days later. I went to his room and picked him up, but he kept crying. I tried everything I usually did. I changed his diaper. I offered him water. I checked if he was too hot or too cold. Nothing worked. He just kept crying and reaching for me, and I didn't know what he needed. I sat in the rocking chair with him and just held him. After maybe 20 minutes, he stopped crying and put his head on my shoulder. I realized he just needed me to be there. He needed to know I wasn't going anywhere. We sat like that for another hour until he fell back asleep. When I put him in his crib and walked back to my room, I understood something I hadn't before. We had bonded over these past 2 months in a way that felt real and permanent. He trusted me completely. I had learned his rhythms and his needs. I could tell when he was tired versus hungry versus just wanting attention. What felt impossible at first now felt natural most days. I was his father in every way that mattered. That reality had settled into my bones and I wasn't scared of it anymore. I had a session with the grief counselor the next week, and I spent most of it talking about my anger at everyone who kept Iris's secrets. Her sister knew. Her parents knew. Her friends knew. They all watched me fall apart thinking she just stopped loving me and nobody said a word. The counselor asked what I wanted to do with that anger. I said I wanted to scream at all of them for lying to me for a year. She asked if that would change anything. I said no. She said I had to choose whether to let that anger poison my relationships with people Christian needed in his life. She said forgiveness might not be possible, but I could work toward acceptance. I could accept that they made an impossible choice because someone they loved asked them to. I could accept that they were trying to honor Iris's wishes, even if I thought those wishes were wrong. Acceptance felt like giving up, but the counselor said it wasn't. She said acceptance was choosing to move forward without letting the past destroy my future. I wasn't there yet, but I was trying. I took Christian to visit Iris's grave for the first time on a Sunday morning. The cemetery was quiet, and the grass was wet from rain the night before. I carried Christian to her headstone and set him down. He immediately started pulling up grass and putting it in his mouth, so I had to watch him constantly. I stood there looking at her name carved in stone, and I talked to her. I told her I understood why she made her choices, even though I hated them. I told her I was raising our son, and he was amazing, and she would be so proud of him. I told her I was still angry, but I was trying to let it go because holding on to it was hurting me more than anyone else. I told her I thought she'd be proud of the father I was becoming, despite my terror and my mistakes. Christian found a stick and started hitting the headstone with it. I took it away from him and he cried. I picked him up and held him and told Iris I was doing my best. That was all I could promise her. Hadrian came over for dinner the following Saturday. He brought pizza and beer and we sat on my couch while Christian played on the floor. Hadrian watched him for a while, and then he said he was proud of me. He said when this all started he wasn't sure I could handle it, but I had stepped up in ways he didn't expect. His validation meant more than I thought it would. My whole family had embraced Christian completely. My mother watched him twice a week and loved every minute of it. My father had opened a savings account for his college fund. Hadrian's kids treated him like their cousin. Christian was going to grow up surrounded by family who loved him, even though his mother was gone. That mattered more than I could put into words. I attended a parent-teacher conference at the daycare on a Thursday afternoon. 2 teachers sat across from me and talked about Christian's development and personality. They said he was resilient and affectionate. They said he played well with other kids and followed directions better than most children his age. They said he seemed happy and secure. They had no idea he lost his mother 2 months ago. They had no idea his entire world had been turned upside down. Looking at him, you would never know. Knowing I was providing that stability for him despite my own grief felt like the first thing I had done right in months. I drove home from that meeting feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I had another session with the grief counselor, and we talked about my resentment toward Iris for the choice she made. I asked if I would ever fully forgive her for keeping Christian from me. The counselor was quiet for a long time, and then she said, forgiveness might not be the goal. She said maybe I could work toward accepting that Iris made an impossible choice from a place of love, even if I believed it was the wrong choice. She said I could honor her memory for Christian while still being angry about what she took from me. She said those things could exist together. I didn't know if I believed her, but I wanted to. Sterling showed up on a Tuesday night with pizza and 2 beers, dropping onto my couch like he'd done 100 times before. Christian was already asleep in his crib, and the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Sterling opened both beers and handed me one without asking if I wanted it. We ate pizza straight from the box, and he talked about work drama I barely listened to because my brain was too tired to track who was fighting with who in his office. Then he asked if I was ready to start dating again, and the question landed so wrong I almost laughed. I wasn't even close to ready, but not for the reasons he probably thought. It wasn't just grief anymore keeping me away from relationships. My entire life was centered around Christian now in ways I couldn't explain to someone who didn't have kids. Every decision I made went through a filter of how it affected him. Every free moment I had was spent making sure he was fed and safe and happy. The idea of adding another person to this equation felt impossible, like trying to fit another piece into a puzzle that was already complete. I told Sterling I appreciated him asking, but I wasn't there yet. He nodded and said he understood, but I could tell he didn't really get it. He still saw me as his friend who lost his fiancée and needed to move on. He didn't see that I had moved on, just in a completely different direction than anyone expected. I was a single father first now, and everything else came second. Work came second. Friends came second. My own needs came way down the list after Christian's needs. I was surprised to find I was okay with that. Being Christian's dad had become the most important part of my identity, and I didn't need anything else right now. Christian started calling for Mama 3 nights later, and I didn't know what to do except hold him while he cried. He woke up screaming around 2 in the morning, and when I went to his crib, he was standing up with tears streaming down his face, reaching his arms toward me and saying "Mama" over and over. I picked him up and carried him to the rocking chair in his room, holding him against my chest while he sobbed. He kept saying it, "Mama, Mama, Mama," like if he said it enough times she would appear. My heart broke into smaller and smaller pieces listening to him cry for someone who wasn't coming back. I didn't know if he actually remembered Iris, or if he was just responding to my grief somehow. I rocked him and rubbed his back and told him I was here, that Daddy was here, but it didn't help. He cried himself out eventually and fell asleep on my shoulder, but I kept rocking him anyway because I didn't want to put him down. The grief counselor told me later that week that toddlers process loss differently than adults. She said Christian might not have clear memories of Iris, but he could sense my sadness and confusion, and he was responding to that as much as his own loss. She suggested I start showing him photos of Iris and telling him simple stories about her, keeping her present in his life even though she was gone. So I started doing that. I put a framed photo of Iris holding newborn Christian on the bookshelf in his room where he could see it. I showed him the picture every morning and said, "That's your mama, she loved you so much." I told him simple stories about how she sang to him and read him books and held him when he was tiny. I didn't know if he understood any of it, but it felt important to try. She was his mother, even if he wouldn't remember her, and I needed him to know she existed and loved him. My mother called on a Saturday morning while Christian was eating breakfast and asked if I'd thought about moving back home, closer to family. She said it would be easier for everyone if Christian grew up near his grandparents and cousins, and she could help more with childcare if we lived in the same town. I understood where she was coming from, but I told her no. I'd already decided to stay in our current city, even though moving closer to family would be simpler in a lot of ways. Christian's support system was here. His pediatrician was here. His daycare was here. The grief counselor I'd been seeing was here. Disrupting him again after everything he'd already lost felt cruel and wrong. He was finally settling into routines and familiar places, and yanking him away from that to make my life easier wasn't something I could do. My mother was quiet for a long time, and then she said she was disappointed, but she understood. She said she and my father would visit regularly and make sure Christian knew his family loved him. I thanked her and felt guilty for choosing Christian's needs over what would be more convenient for everyone else, but I also felt certain it was the right choice. I was learning to make parenting decisions based on what Christian needed rather than what was easier for me, and this was one of those decisions. He needed stability more than I needed help, so we were staying put. Maximus called 2 weeks later and asked if he could take Christian for an overnight visit. The request made my stomach clench with anxiety. I didn't want to examine too closely. Christian had never been away from me overnight since I became his father. The idea of him sleeping somewhere else, in a house I couldn't monitor, with people I was still learning to trust, made me want to say no immediately. But I forced myself to think about it rationally, instead of just reacting from fear. Maximus was Christian's grandfather. He loved Christian and wanted to be part of his life. Saying no would damage that relationship and hurt Christian in the long run. I told Maximus I needed to think about it and called him back the next day with a compromise. We could try a trial afternoon visit first, just a few hours, and see how that went before attempting overnight. Maximus agreed without arguing. The visit happened on a Sunday, and I dropped Christian off at Maximus's house with a diaper bag full of supplies and a list of instructions I'd typed up. Maximus took the list and promised to follow it exactly. I left and drove around for 2 hours because I couldn't make myself go home to the empty apartment. I kept checking my phone expecting a call that something went wrong, but it never came. When I picked Christian up, he was happy and tired, covered in crumbs from cookies Maximus had given him. Maximus said they'd had a good time and asked if we could do it again soon. I said yes because I realized I needed to trust that Iris's family loved Christian and wouldn't take him from me. Control was hard to release when I'd already lost so much, but holding on too tight would hurt Christian more than it protected him. I started attending the single-parent support group every Tuesday night, leaving Christian with my mother so I could sit in a church basement with other people navigating solo parenthood. The group was mostly women, but there were a few other single dads, and everyone understood the specific challenges in ways my married friends never could. We talked about childcare logistics and financial stress and the exhaustion of being the only adult responsible for everything. We talked about dating and whether any of us were ready for that, which most of us weren't. A woman named Lauren, whose husband died in a car accident 2 years ago, asked me for coffee after one meeting. She was pretty and kind, and she understood grief in ways most people didn't. I told her I was flattered, but I wasn't ready to date anyone yet. She smiled and said she understood, and we could just be friends if I ever needed someone to talk to. Her interest made me realize something I hadn't fully accepted before. I wouldn't be alone forever. Someday I might be ready to let someone new into our lives, to build something with a person who understood that Christian came first and always would. But that day wasn't now. Right now, I was still processing Iris's death and learning to be Christian's father and rebuilding my life into something sustainable. Adding romance to that mix would be too much, too complicated, too risky when I was barely keeping everything else balanced. Maybe in a year or two I'd be ready. Maybe Lauren would still be single and we could try that coffee. Or maybe it would be someone else entirely, someone I hadn't met yet. Either way, I had time to figure it out. Christian took his first steps on a Thursday afternoon in our living room, and I was the only one there to see it. I'd been folding laundry on the couch while he played with blocks on the floor, and suddenly he pulled himself up using the coffee table and let go. He stood there wobbling for a second, looking surprised at himself, and then he took 3 stumbling steps toward me before falling on his butt. I grabbed my phone and started recording, asking him to do it again, and he did. He walked 5 steps that time, arms out for balance, grinning like he'd just discovered something amazing. I cheered and clapped and he laughed, delighted by my reaction. I sent the video to my entire family and to Iris's parents and to Sterling and Hadrian. Everyone responded with excitement and congratulations. But after I put Christian down for his nap, I sat on the couch and cried because Iris should have been here for this. She should have seen her son's first steps. She should have been the one cheering and recording and calling family to share the news. This was her moment as much as mine, maybe more, and she missed it because she chose to die alone rather than let me watch her suffer. The joy and grief were so tangled together, I couldn't separate them anymore. Every milestone Christian hit was both beautiful and devastating. Beautiful because he was growing and developing and thriving. Devastating because Iris wasn't here to see it, and I couldn't share these moments with the person who should have been experiencing them with me. I was Christian's only parent, and that meant I got all the joy and all the grief, and sometimes the weight of both together felt crushing. I found myself talking to Iris sometimes when I was alone with Christian, telling her about his milestones and asking her advice I would never receive. I did it without thinking, just started narrating our days to her like she was standing in the corner of the room watching us. I told her about his first steps and how proud she would have been. I told her about his favorite foods and the way he laughed when I made funny faces. I told her about my fears that I was doing everything wrong, that I was failing him in ways I couldn't see yet. I asked her questions about what she would do in certain situations, how she would handle his tantrums or his sleep problems or his picky eating. Obviously, she never answered, but talking to her helped somehow. The grief counselor said this was normal and healthy when I mentioned it during our next session. She said maintaining a connection to Iris's memory helped me process her loss while honoring her role in creating our son. She said as long as I wasn't hearing Iris's voice responding or having conversations with her that felt real, talking to her was just another form of grief work. So I kept doing it. I talked to Iris while I gave Christian baths and read him bedtime stories and pushed him on the swings at the park. I told her about our life and hoped somehow she could hear me, that she knew Christian was safe and loved and thriving despite everything. Work called me into a meeting on a Monday morning, and I walked in expecting bad news, maybe a conversation about my reduced productivity or too many days working from home. Instead, my manager offered me a promotion to a senior position with better pay and more flexibility. She said they recognized my performance had remained strong despite my personal challenges, and they wanted to support my growth with the company. The new position came with a significant raise and the option to work from home 3 days a week instead of 2. I accepted immediately and thanked her, trying not to cry from relief right there in her office. The financial security helped tremendously with childcare costs and saving for Christian's future. I could afford better daycare now, maybe even start a college fund that would actually mean something by the time he turned 18. I was rebuilding my life in a shape I never expected when I proposed to Iris 3 years ago. I wasn't engaged or planning a wedding or building toward the future I thought I wanted. Instead, I was a single father with a toddler and a demanding job and grief that still hit me at random moments throughout the day. But it was becoming a life I could actually sustain, one that didn't feel like constant survival mode. I had routines and support systems and enough money to cover our needs. Christian was happy and healthy. I was functioning and sometimes even finding moments of peace. It wasn't the life I planned, but it was ours, and that had to be enough. I read Iris's letter to Christian again late one night after he went to sleep, and this time I could see it through her eyes instead of just my own anger and hurt. She was a dying woman trying to give her child the best possible future, even if it meant breaking her own heart. She was sick and scared and facing her own death, and she chose to protect me from that pain, even though it meant suffering alone. She chose to continue her pregnancy, even though it meant less aggressive treatment and probably less time alive. She chose to document Christian's first year in photos and journals, so I would know what I missed. Every choice she made came from love, even if I believed those choices were wrong. I still disagreed with her decision to keep Christian from me. I still felt angry that she took away my choice to be there for both of them. But I understood her love now in ways I couldn't before I became a parent myself. I understood the desperate need to protect your child from pain, even if that protection meant making choices that hurt. I understood loving someone so much you would sacrifice your own happiness to give them a better life. I didn't forgive her. Not exactly. But I understood her. And maybe that understanding was enough for now. Christian got sick with another fever the following week, and this time I handled it calmly, knowing what was normal and what required medical attention. I checked his temperature and gave him the correct dose of medicine and monitored him for concerning symptoms without panicking. When his fever spiked to 102, I called Celine's office and spoke to the nurse, who told me what to watch for and when to bring him in if things got worse. I kept him home from daycare and spent 2 days managing a cranky, clingy toddler who wanted to be held constantly. It was exhausting but not terrifying like the first time he got sick. I knew what I was doing now. I knew the difference between a normal childhood illness and something serious. Celine called to check on him the next day and commented on how much more confident I sounded as a parent compared to our first few appointments. I realized she was right. The terror had faded into something more manageable, a competence born from repetition and necessity. I was still scared of failing Christian or making mistakes that would hurt him, but I trusted myself now in ways I didn't 3 months ago. I knew how to take care of him. I knew his needs and his rhythms and his personality. I was his father in every way that mattered, and I was doing a decent job at it despite my fears and my grief and my complete lack of preparation for any of this. Maximus called me the following week and asked if we could talk about the holidays. Thanksgiving was coming up in a few months, and he wanted to know if Christian could spend part of the day with Iris's family. I invited him over to my apartment that evening after Christian went to sleep because these conversations felt too important to have over the phone. He arrived looking tired and older than I remembered from our previous meetings. We sat at my kitchen table with coffee between us, and neither of us knew quite how to start. He finally said he knew I was Christian's father, and he respected Iris's choice to leave him with me. But Christian was also his grandson, and he wanted to be part of his life in meaningful ways. I told him I understood, and I wanted Christian to know his mother's family, but we needed to figure out how to do this without confusing him or creating conflict. Maximus nodded and pulled out a small notebook where he'd written down ideas for sharing holidays and creating traditions. He suggested alternating Thanksgiving and Christmas each year, or splitting the days so Christian could see both families. He wanted to take Christian to visit Iris's grave on her birthday and the anniversary of her death. He wanted to tell Christian stories about Iris when he got old enough to understand. I listened to all of it and realized we were both just trying to keep Iris present in Christian's life while building something new. We talked for 2 hours about schedules and boundaries and what felt fair to everyone involved. Maximus admitted he was still angry about Iris's decision to keep her illness secret from me, and he struggled with understanding why she thought lying was better than letting me help her. I told him I felt the same way most days, and we were both learning to live with choices we didn't get to make. We agreed that Christian deserved to know both sides of his family, and to grow up understanding his mother loved him desperately, even if her choices were complicated. Before Maximus left, he showed me a photo of Iris holding Christian in the hospital right after he was born, and she looked exhausted and happy, and so completely in love with our son. He said he wanted me to have it because I deserved to see that moment, even though I wasn't there for it. I had my regular appointment with the grief counselor the next afternoon, and I told her about my conversation with Maximus. She asked how I felt about sharing Christian with Iris's family, and whether it brought up complicated emotions about Iris's choices. I admitted it did, because every interaction with her family reminded me of what she kept from me, and how many people knew the truth while I believed she just stopped loving me. The counselor listened, and then said something that shifted my understanding of everything. She said my anger at Iris had changed over the past few months, and wasn't the simple rage I felt when I first learned the truth. Now it was layered with sadness that she faced her illness alone, anger that she didn't trust me with the truth, gratitude that she gave me Christian, and heartbreak that she wasn't here to parent him with me. She said I could hold all these feelings at once without needing to resolve them into something simpler or more comfortable. I didn't have to forgive Iris or agree with her choices to acknowledge they came from love. I didn't have to stop being angry to also feel grateful for our son. The counselor said grief was messy and complicated and full of contradictions, and trying to force it into a neat narrative was exhausting and impossible. I sat there taking in her words and feeling something loosen in my chest. I'd been trying so hard to figure out how I was supposed to feel about Iris and her choices, like there was a right answer I needed to find. But maybe there wasn't a right answer, and I could just feel everything without judgment or resolution. The counselor said this was growth, and it meant I was processing my grief in healthy ways instead of getting stuck in one emotion. She asked if I felt ready to reduce our sessions from weekly to every other week, and I realized I did. I still needed support, but I was learning to navigate my feelings without constant guidance. Saturday morning, I took Christian to the park near our apartment because the weather was perfect, and he'd been restless all week. I pushed him on the swings and helped him climb the small slide and watched him run around with other kids his age. He was completely fearless, throwing himself into play with the kind of trust that only small children have. I sat on a bench nearby and just observed him for a while. This little person who was half me and half Iris and entirely himself. He laughed when another kid shared a toy truck with him, and he fell down twice chasing a ball and got right back up without crying. I had a moment of pure contentment watching him that surprised me completely. This was my life now. Single father and grief survivor and man rebuilding from loss, and it wasn't what I planned when I proposed to Iris 3 years ago. But it was mine, and it was real, and it was happening whether I felt ready for it or not. Christian ran over to me for a hug and buried his face in my shirt, and I felt purpose in a way I hadn't since Iris left. This kid needed me, and trusted me, and loved me, and that mattered more than anything else. We stayed at the park for 2 hours until Christian started getting cranky from hunger and tiredness. I carried him home on my shoulders, and he grabbed my hair and giggled the whole way, and I thought about how far we'd come in just a few months. I wasn't the terrified man who didn't know how to change a diaper anymore, and Christian wasn't the scared toddler being handed to a stranger. We were building something together that honored Iris's sacrifice while creating our own story. That night, after Christian fell asleep, I sat down at my desk and opened a blank document on my computer. I'd been thinking about the grief counselor's suggestion to write letters to Christian for when he got older, documenting our life together and telling him about his mother from my perspective. I wanted him to know the full truth when he was ready to understand it, not some sanitized version that made everything seem simple and resolved. I started typing, and the words came easier than I expected. I wrote about meeting Iris in college and falling in love with her completely. I wrote about our engagement and how happy we were planning our wedding. I wrote about the night she left and how destroyed I felt believing she stopped loving me. I wrote about learning the truth a year later and meeting him for the first time in that parking lot. I told him his mother loved him desperately and made impossible choices to give him life, and I was angry about those choices even while understanding they came from love. I told him grief was complicated and messy, and I was still figuring out how to feel about everything that happened. I told him he was worth every difficult moment of the past few months, and I wouldn't change having him in my life, even though the circumstances were painful. I wrote for an hour and saved the letter in a folder I labeled with his name. I planned to write more letters as time went on, creating a record of our life together and my evolving feelings about Iris and her choices. Someday, when he was old enough to ask questions about his mother and why she made the decisions she did, I wanted him to have my honest perspective alongside whatever Iris's family told him. Iris's sister called me the following Tuesday and asked if we could meet for coffee. She sounded nervous on the phone, and I immediately worried something was wrong with Christian's medical records or legal paperwork. We met at the same coffee shop where she first told me about Iris's death and Christian's existence, and sitting there brought back the shock and devastation of that afternoon. She got straight to the point and told me she was moving to our city to be closer to Christian. She'd found a job and an apartment and would be settled within a month. Part of me immediately worried about boundaries and whether she'd try to interfere with my parenting or second-guess my decisions. But another part of me felt relieved that Christian would have more family nearby who loved him and wanted to be part of his life. She must have seen the conflict on my face because she quickly said she wasn't trying to take over or act like his mother. She just wanted to be his aunt and help however she could. She said she'd been living with guilt since the day she handed him to me, knowing she kept Iris's secrets and helped her hide the truth from me. She said she struggled with that promise every single day of Iris's illness and after her death, torn between honoring her sister's wishes and believing I deserved to know. I told her I understood impossible choices better now than I did a few months ago, and we both did what we thought was right, even if the outcomes were painful. We agreed to move forward focused on Christian's well-being, rather than rehashing the past. She asked if she could babysit sometimes or take him to the park, and I said yes because Christian needed all the love and support he could get. She cried and thanked me for being gracious when I had every right to shut her out completely. The anniversary of Iris's death arrived in early November, and her family planned a memorial service at the cemetery. They invited me and asked if I would bring Christian, even though he was too young to understand what was happening. I dressed him in nice clothes and drove to the cemetery feeling anxious about seeing Iris's extended family all together. Some of them probably blamed me for not being there during her illness, not knowing she actively kept me away. Others might judge me for being angry at her choices when she was dead and couldn't defend herself. But I was Christian's father, and he deserved to be part of this grieving family because of our son. So I went. The service was small and intimate with maybe 20 people gathered around Iris's headstone. Her mother had arranged flowers and someone brought balloons that we would release at the end. I stood at the back holding Christian while different people shared memories of Iris. Her college roommate talked about her kindness and her terrible cooking. Her cousin remembered family vacations and inside jokes. Maximus spoke about her strength during her illness and how she faced death with grace. When it was my turn, I stepped forward with Christian on my hip and told stories about our relationship that made her parents smile through tears. I talked about our first date and how she laughed at all my bad jokes. I described the night I proposed and how she said yes before I finished asking. I talked about our plans for the future and how excited we were to build a life together. I didn't mention her leaving or the lies or my anger because this wasn't the place for that complexity. This was a moment to honor the woman everyone loved and missed. After I finished speaking, we released the balloons and watched them float into the gray November sky. Christian pointed at them and said something that sounded like wow, and Iris's mother reached over to touch his hand gently. That evening after we got home, Christian was tired and clingy from the long day. I gave him a bath and put him in pajamas and rocked him in the chair in his room. He was almost asleep when he looked up at me with those eyes that were so much like Iris's and said something that sounded like love you, Dada. I froze because I wasn't sure if I heard him correctly or if it was just baby babbling. But then he said it again more clearly and patted my chest with his small hand. I completely fell apart with joy right there in the rocking chair, crying and holding him close while he looked at me with confusion about why I was upset. He was thriving despite everything he'd lost, and I was doing better than I thought possible a few months ago. We were building a life together that honored Iris's sacrifice while creating our own story, and hearing him say he loved me felt like confirmation that we were going to be okay. I told him I loved him too, and kissed his forehead and finished rocking him to sleep. After I put him in his crib, I stood there watching him breathe for a long time, overwhelmed by how much I loved this kid and how grateful I was that Iris gave him to me, even though her methods were painful. The next morning, I made a decision about how to handle Iris's presence in our home. For months, I'd struggled with whether to display photos of her or talk about her openly, worried it would confuse Christian or make my grief harder to manage. But the grief counselor's words about holding complicated feelings stuck with me, and I realized I could honor Iris while also being angry at her choices. I spent the weekend going through boxes of photos and selecting ones that showed her happy and healthy. I framed several pictures and put them in Christian's room in the living room where he'd see them every day. I created a small shelf with Iris's journal and the letters she wrote, and some of her belongings that Christian could explore when he got older. The grief counselor had said children benefit from knowing their full history, and I wanted Christian to grow up understanding his mother loved him enough to choose his life, even when it meant less time for herself. I wanted him to know I loved him enough to raise him well and tell him the truth about where he came from. That afternoon, I had a session with the counselor and told her about my decision to keep Iris present rather than hiding her away. She affirmed my approach and said it would help Christian develop a healthy relationship with his mother's memory as he grew up. She said I was doing the hard work of integrating my grief into daily life rather than compartmentalizing it, and that was exactly what Christian needed to see modeled. My mother called that week and offered to watch Christian for a weekend so I could have some time alone. I hadn't been away from him for more than a few hours since he came into my life, and part of me resisted the idea of being separated that long. But I was exhausted, and I knew I needed space to process everything without the constant demands of toddler care. I dropped Christian off at my parents' house on Friday evening with detailed instructions about his routines and favorite foods. My mother smiled and told me to relax and trust that she raised 3 boys successfully. I drove back to my empty apartment and felt strange being alone after months of constant company. Saturday morning, I woke up late and made coffee and sat in silence that felt both peaceful and lonely. I decided to visit Iris's grave by myself without Christian or her family around. I needed to have a conversation with her that was just between us, no audience or performance required. I drove to the cemetery and found her headstone and sat down in the grass beside it. I talked to her for over an hour about forgiveness and anger and love and parenting. I told her Christian was amazing and looked just like her and had her smile. I told her I was doing my best to raise him well even though I was scared of messing up. I told her I was still angry she didn't trust me with the truth, but I understood she was trying to protect me in her own misguided way. I told her I wished she was here to parent him with me because doing it alone was hard and I missed her desperately. I told her I thought we were going to be okay, Christian and me, and I hoped she would be proud of the father I was becoming. I sat there crying and talking to a headstone like she could actually hear me, and it felt cathartic in ways I didn't expect. When I finally left, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd released some of the weight I'd been carrying. Sunday afternoon, I joined a father's playgroup that met weekly at the community center. Sterling had suggested it months ago, but I'd been too overwhelmed to consider it. Now I was ready to connect with other dads navigating parenthood and build some normalcy into our lives. The group was casual and welcoming with about 8 fathers and their kids ranging from infants to preschoolers. We let the kids play while we talked about sleep schedules and picky eating and developmental milestones. Nobody asked about my situation, and I didn't volunteer the complicated story of how I became a single father. They just accepted me as one of them, another dad trying to figure things out and keep his kid happy and healthy. Their friendship helped me feel less isolated in ways that surprised me. I wasn't just the grieving widower or the guy whose fiancé lied anymore. I was Christian's dad first and foremost, and that identity was becoming the primary way I saw myself. After the playgroup ended, one of the dads invited me to grab lunch with him and his son the following week, and I said yes, because I was ready to build community beyond my family and old friends. I picked up Christian from my parents' house that evening, and he reached for me immediately, and I realized how much I'd missed him, even though the break was good for both of us. My mother brought over a sleep training book she'd used with my brothers, and I read it cover to cover that same night. Christian was 18 months old now, and still waking up twice a night wanting comfort or a bottle, and I was so tired I could barely think straight anymore. The book suggested a gradual approach where I'd sit next to his crib and slowly move farther away each night until he learned to fall asleep on his own. I started the process that weekend, and it was brutal. He cried and reached for me through the crib bars, while I sat 3 feet away fighting every instinct to pick him up. The first night took 2 hours before he finally fell asleep from exhaustion. The second night was 90 minutes. By the end of the first week, he was sleeping through the night consistently, and I woke up one morning actually feeling rested for the first time in months. The fog that had been clouding my brain since he arrived lifted enough that I could think clearly about our future, instead of just surviving each day. I started making real plans for his second birthday party, researching preschools in our neighborhood for when he turned 3, considering whether we should stay in this apartment or find something with a yard. I could finally breathe again without the constant weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. I felt like myself for the first time since Iris's sister handed me a child and changed my entire life. Maximus called and asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss visitation, and I agreed because our current arrangement felt too informal and inconsistent. We met at the same coffee shop where I'd first learned about Iris's death and Christian's existence, and the location felt both appropriate and painful. Maximus looked older than he had 6 months ago, grief carving deeper lines into his face, but he seemed calmer than our early angry encounters. He said he and Iris's mother wanted to be part of Christian's life regularly, not just occasional visits when I felt generous. He said they'd lost their daughter and they couldn't lose their grandson too. I understood that feeling completely because I'd lost Iris twice myself. We worked out a schedule where Christian would spend every other Saturday with Iris's parents, and they could join us for major holidays and birthdays. Maximus asked if he could take Christian to visit Iris's grave sometimes, and I said yes because Christian should know where his mother rests. We agreed that all decisions about Christian's education, medical care, and major life choices would be mine alone as his father, but Iris's parents would be consistent, loving presences in his daily life. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension when Maximus looked at me like he blamed me for something I couldn't control, but it was functional and centered on what Christian needed. We were creating a co-parenting arrangement across family lines that honored everyone's connection to Christian while respecting boundaries. Maximus showed me photos on his phone of Iris pregnant with Christian, smiling despite being sick, and I had to look away because seeing her like that still hurt too much. I scheduled what I hoped would be my final session with the grief counselor, wanting to review my progress and see if I'd developed enough tools to continue healing on my own. We sat in her familiar office, and she asked me to reflect on where I'd been 6 months ago versus where I was now. 6 months ago, I was drowning in rage at Iris for dying, for lying, for making choices about my life without asking me. I was terrified of failing Christian and convinced I'd ruin him somehow. I was isolated and overwhelmed and barely functioning beyond basic survival. Now I was managing my anger at Iris better, understanding her impossible position even if I still disagreed with her choice. I was confident as Christian's father, knowing his routines and needs, able to comfort him when he was upset and celebrate his small victories. I was building community through the father's playgroup and maintaining my friendships despite my new responsibilities. I was finding genuine moments of happiness instead of just enduring each day. The counselor said I'd done the hard work of integrating my grief into daily life rather than trying to overcome it or push it away. She said I could return any time if I needed support, but I'd developed strong coping skills and a solid support network. I asked if it was normal to still feel angry at Iris sometimes, and she said grief doesn't follow a timeline or resolve neatly. She said I might always carry complicated feelings about her choice, and that was okay as long as those feelings didn't consume me or affect how I parented Christian. I left her office feeling lighter, knowing I could handle whatever came next without needing weekly therapy sessions to stay functional. I packed up Christian and drove 3 hours to the coast for a weekend beach trip, wanting to give him new experiences beyond our daily routines. He'd never seen the ocean, and I wanted to watch him discover it for the first time. We checked into a small hotel near the beach, and I could hear the waves from our room. The next morning, I carried him down to the sand and set him down near the water's edge. He stood there staring at the endless blue expanse like he couldn't process what he was seeing. A wave rolled in and touched his toes, and he jumped back laughing, then ran toward the water again, wanting more. I spent the next hour following him up and down the beach while he chased waves and collected shells and got completely covered in wet sand. His joy was so pure and infectious that I found myself laughing harder than I had in over a year. I took hundreds of photos on my phone, wanting to document every moment of his delight. I wished desperately that Iris could see him like this, healthy and happy and loved, experiencing the world with complete wonder. I promised her silently that I'd give him the beautiful life she wanted for him, that I'd make sure he grew up knowing adventure and joy despite the tragedy of his beginning. Christian fell asleep in the car on the drive home, sun-tired and content, and I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, thinking about how far we'd both come. Sterling stopped by with pizza one evening, and after Christian went to bed, he said I seemed different from I had in over a year. He said I seemed lighter somehow, less weighed down by everything that happened. I realized he was right when I thought about it. The grief hasn't disappeared, and I still have hard days when I miss Iris so much it physically hurts, but the grief has integrated into my daily life, rather than consuming it completely. I'm Christian's father first, and that identity has become the primary way I see myself, instead of being the guy whose fiancé lied or the grieving widower. I'm rebuilding my career around my parenting responsibilities, and my boss has been supportive of my flexible schedule. I'm maintaining my friendships even though I can't be as available as I used to be. I'm honoring Iris's memory by raising our son well and making sure he knows she loved him, but I'm also living fully in the present instead of staying trapped in the past. Sterling said he was proud of me for not just surviving, but actually building a good life for Christian and myself. I told him there were still moments when the anger came back strong, when I wanted to scream at Iris for making her choice without giving me any say, but those moments were getting less frequent and less intense. I was learning to hold space for complicated feelings without letting them define my entire existence. On what would have been our wedding anniversary, I took Christian to visit Iris's grave and brought flowers to plant. He was too young to understand the significance, but someday I'd tell him about the woman who loved us both enough to make an impossible sacrifice. I dug small holes in the dirt near her headstone, and Christian helped me plant purple irises, his namesake flower, getting soil all over his hands and clothes. He patted the dirt down carefully like I showed him and said pretty when we finished. I sat there in the grass with him playing nearby and talked to Iris like I sometimes did when I needed to process things. I told her I was at peace with our complicated story now, not because I'd resolved all my feelings about her choice, but because I'd accepted that some questions don't have answers and some grief doesn't fully heal. I told her Christian was amazing and looked more like her every day, and I was doing my best to be the father he deserved. I told her I understood she was trying to protect me, even though I wished she'd trusted me enough to face her illness together. I told her I forgave her for lying, even though I'd never stop wishing things had been different. Christian brought me a dandelion he'd picked, and I tucked it next to the irises we'd planted. We were building a good life together, honoring his mother's love while creating our own path forward, and that was enough.